friends, welcome to Sasser House. My name is Emily Ann, and in today's video, I'm going to show you step by step how I crocheted this granny square blanket. Blanket is super easy, and I ended up only making 20 granny squares to make this blanket, so it's not that many granny squares to work with. Now you can make yours with however many you want. If you want to make this the size to cover a king size bed, you do that, all right? But this is the size that I wanted to make for mine, and you'll hear me a couple times in the video say that I did 6 by 4, but I ended up only doing 5 by 4 because it ended up being plenty big with just 5 by 4 and 20 squares total. So if you want to see how I made this blanket, just keep watching. Supplies needed for this blanket are a 5mm crochet hook. You can use a 5, 5.5, or 6, whichever one you prefer, or you can follow the instructions on the back of your yarn. This one calls for a 5mm, but sometimes they call for 5.5 or 6. You can use whichever one you like, but I like the 5. You'll also need a pair of scissors as well as a yarn needle. So for my blanket, I made 24 squares. I did 4 squares across and 6 squares down. You can make this however big or however small you want, and same thing goes for the size of your squares individually. I did mine 10 rows each, but you could do 4 rows, you could do 20 rows each, you could do whatever you want to do, and that's what makes granny squares and crocheting so fun, is you can make it totally how you want to do it. So here's some examples of what my squares look like. I didn't really have any rhyme or reason when it came to colors. Some of these were even old squares that I didn't need for projects that I made in the past that I just held on to and I added onto them. So I really didn't have like a color scheme, but if you want that, you can totally do that as well. When it comes to yarn, be sure to use yarn that is a size 4 medium weight. And you wanna make sure all the yarn that you use is the same weight, because when you're making the granny squares, if it's different sizes, then it might not look as cohesive and it could get a little wonky. So make sure you use size 4 medium weight yarn. You can use all different kinds of yarn brand wise. They all work up really good. For granny squares specifically, I like to always hold on to my scraps of yarn. So I have this basket that sits in my yarn cabinet, and I have all different kinds of odds and ends balls of yarn. Like even if right here, if you have this much, that's probably enough to make the inside of a granny square, like the first row. So I always hold on to it because I know that I'll use it up at some point when I'm making granny squares. So maybe if you have a yarn collection and you have thrown away just little leftover ends like this because you don't know what to do with them, now this will give you something to do with your scraps. Now let's make our granny square. So I have an in-depth tutorial for beginners if you have never crocheted before that I will link below this video, as well as a beginner step-by-step tutorial to make this exact granny square that we will be making. If you are a beginner and you want to take it really slow, then I would definitely check out those videos first. But if you have been crocheting for a little bit and you're not intimidated by it, then you can definitely watch this tutorial in this video right here. So to start the first round of your granny square, you need to make a slip knot, put your hook through the loop, pull the yarn onto the hook, and then chain 4. Now you want to insert your hook into that first chain that you worked and work a slip stitch to form a ring that we're going to be working into for our square. Now we're going to chain 2, and this counts as our first double crochet. We need to work 2 more double crochets, just working right into the center of that ring that we made. Now since this is our first round and we're really kind of forming the shape of our square, we need to do 3 chains. And then we're gonna work another set of 3 double crochets right into the center of that ring that we made. Okay, we need to turn another corner, so chain 3. work another set of 3 double crochets, chain 3, and as you can see, we have 3 sides of our square done. So this will be the last set of 3 double crochets. But now we need to close off this last corner, so we're going to chain 3 and then slip stitch into that first double crochet that we worked. And as you can see, you have your first round of your granny square done. So once you finish that, I like to just pull through, kind of like I'm making a chain, and pull through a loop, cut the yarn, and then pull that through to secure it and tie a knot. Some people like to weave in their ends as they go, and some people like to wait until their granny square is finished to weave in the ends. Just so that it will be a nicer video to watch, I'm gonna go ahead and weave in my ends. So all I'm doing here is using my yarn needle, putting those little tails that we have and making sure that I'm working on the back of our square and not the front. I just pull them through, and see, we worked over that tail as we worked, and so that one doesn't have to be woven in that much. As you can see, here's the front, here's the back. I'm just gonna push it down one of the rows and then get into all of these loops down here and pull that. And you want it to be, you know, secure and snug, but you don't want it to be super tight because it can make your square get a wonky shape. So once you've woven those in and cut those, you're left with the first round of your granny square. Now it's time to start our second row and add in our new color, and I'm gonna go in with this pale yellow. To attach the new color, I just pull the yarn through one of the corners and tie a simple knot, and it's attached just like that. Now make sure when you move on to any more rows on your square that you are always working with the right side facing you instead of the wrong side facing you, because if you started this way, then your second row would be the right side, but your first row would be the wrong side, and it just wouldn't look as neat and clean. So we're gonna start in this corner, and I'm just gonna pull the yarn up through to get that loop on my hook, and I'm going to, once again, chain 2. Now these get really repetitive as you get used to them and as you work them. That's what makes granny squares so fun. They can become so mindless. You can make them however big or however small you want. So all you have to remember is that 2 sets separated by a chain of 3 always go in the corners, and 1 set of your 3 double crochets will go along the straight side. So we won't have any straight sides to work right now because we only have these corners to work into. So I just chained 2. I'm gonna work 2 more double crochets. And there's our first set of 3 double crochets. We need to do a chain of 3, and in that exact same corner, we're gonna work another set of 3 double crochets. And you might not be able to see it yet, but hopefully you can tell that this is the new corner of our next square. We're gonna work immediately into that next corner space, work 3 double crochets, make a chain of 3, and then work another set of double crochets. And then we'll just continue this all the way around the square. And now, once again, we just need to connect these. So working into the first double crochet that we worked and making a slip stitch, and then pulling up a loop and cutting that yarn. We still need to weave in our ends, but that is our second round of our granny square. So here's what our square is looking like after 2 rounds. And now we are introduced to a space in between the clusters of 3 double crochets on a straight edge. We still have our corners just like we had before, where we'll work 2 sets of the 3 double crochets separated by a chain of 3, but now we have this straight edge. So going in with a new color, I'm attaching that yarn, and starting in the corner space again, I'm going to chain 2 just like before, and then work 2 more double crochets, chain 3, and then work another set of 3 double crochets into that same corner space. Now we've made it to our first straight edge, so all we're gonna do is work 1 set of 3 double crochets right into that space. You don't need to chain 3 or do anything to separate this set from this set because it's just a straight edge. And same thing goes when you're going into the next corner. You just immediately start working your next set of 3 double crochets into that corner. The only time you chain 3 to separate them is when you are turning a corner. That chain 3 makes your corner. So once again, we have another straight edge, and we're gonna work right into that space and work 3 double crochets. And then we'll just work immediately into the next corner and work it the way we've worked all of them. So I'll meet you when we get to the end of round 3. All right, so we finished up round 3, and as you can see now, we have got 2 spaces to work on the straight edges as well as our corners. So as you continue this, you just keep increasing and increasing and increasing, and that's what gives you all of those beautiful rounds that you get in working granny squares. So as you can tell, hopefully, how repetitive this pattern gets, you just continue working these rounds and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, making sure to work 1 set of the 3 double crochets into these straight spaces. And when you get into the corners, working 2 sets separated by a chain of 3. So I work my rounds until I get 10 rounds. I think that that is a really great size for this quilt that we're making, and that's just what I decided to do. So I'm gonna go ahead and finish this square up, and then I will show you how we attach these squares together to join them into the most beautiful blanket. When all your squares are done and you're ready to join them together to form your blanket, then it will be time to start sewing your edges together. Now, I love this way of joining squares. It is an invisible join, and it's just the easiest, simplest way to do it, and I think it leaves really clean, nice edges when your squares are joined together. So all you need is your yarn needle and some yarn. I'm using a yellow yarn. It doesn't really matter what color because you're not gonna see it because it is an invisible join. Now what I like to do is join my squares together in a row. So I'm gonna join all of the sides of each of my squares together. And I told you I'm doing 4 by 6, so I will have 4 squares wide, and I will sew each of these edges together. And then once I have 1 long strip, then I'll make another round of 4, and then I'll sew them together at the bottom, if that makes sense. So right now, we only need 2 squares to join together. And one of the things that you have to make sure that you have right in doing this join is you want the right sides of your square. So right now we're looking at the right sides. These are the wrong sides. You want the right sides of your squares on top of each other. So right sides together and wrong sides facing outward. Now I'm gonna cut a strip of yarn, and I usually just measure it along the square itself and leave a little overhang on each side. Doesn't matter which side you sew together when you're first starting. Just line up those corner pieces, and then what you wanna do is insert your yarn needle in the outside loops only of each square. And you wanna make sure that you're lining up each loop with the corresponding loop on the other square. Right here, if I pull it towards me, I can see my stitches. I've got an outside loop and an inside loop. Same on this side. I have an outside loop and an inside loop. So what you wanna do is working in that outside loop, put the yarn just through the outside loop, and then go over to the other square in the same space and put it through the outside loop, and then pull your yarn through. Now this is the only time we're not going to work back and forth this way. This is just going to give us a secure hold down here at the bottom. I'm going to come back around to this one and work through there, and then that makes it to where that's not going to slip and slide on us. But now that our yarn is facing this way, now we're going to go in from this side, outside loop to outside loop, and pull the yarn through. Then go to the next space, outside loop to outside loop, pull through, outside loop to outside loop, pull through, outside loop to outside loop, pull through. But you just continue this all the way down the side of your project. And it might sound intimidating to just get the yarn needle exactly through those outside loops. But as you can see, as you work, it's really the loops that stick out the most because they're on the outer edges. And when you have the insides of your squares facing each other and the outsides facing out, it kind of puckers up that outside loop. So it's really easy to just put your yarn needle right where it needs to go and work down your project. Then once you make it to the end, you can just open it up and see how those squares joined just beautifully. Don't worry about your two ends. We'll take care of those later. So now we're just gonna add in another square. So we have our first square, second square, and here we have our third one. But we are gonna put this right side facing down. And we don't want it to be attached this way or this way. We want it to flip open this way. So that means we will be joining them just like this. So measure out another piece of yarn, cut that for sewing, and then repeat that same process right along this border. And once you have your third one down, you can flip that one out and check it out. And just like that, you join these together. So once you get the hang of it, you can really start joining them together pretty quickly. We have one more square that we need to add in to finish out our row of 4. So I'll do that, and then I will meet you back up when it is time to add this to the rest of our blanket rows. All right, I'm having to zoom way out because I have already started joining the other rows of our blanket, and this is the last row, and it is a pretty wide blanket. So what we need to do here, let me make sure I have these lined up where I want them, and I don't. I want this like this. Okay. Make sure that's lined up where I want it. And it is. So what we're gonna do, scooch that out of the way, pull this up here. And as you can see, I have all of these rows done. So this is what I meant by, making strips and then sewing them together. For whatever reason in my head, this just makes the most sense, but you can do whatever makes sense to you. So making sure I have my right sides facing up, I'm gonna put the right side of my new row on top of the blanket. And see, we've got all of these tails right here. And if you want to, you can do this now, or you can do it as you go. But what we're gonna end up doing is just tying these in a knot. I'll just go ahead and do these. And that just makes it even more secure. And then we'll end up weaving all of these in at the end. But that's what you'll do with all of your little tails. Sorry, just making sure we're in the frame. Okay, so what I'm gonna do is get my yarn that I'm using to sew all these together and cut a long strip. Just measure the width of our blanket and cut us a long strip. Get our yarn on our needle, and now just starting at one end the same way we did this whole time, except now with just a lot bigger pieces, we are just going to insert into those outside loops, pull that yarn all the way through, leaving a little tail, and then this is the only time we crisscross over. And now we'll just work in the direction that the yarn is running back and forth all the way down. So I just finished up sewing together this row. So when you flip it over, you've got that nice, beautiful seam. So now that I have put these rows together and I have laid out the blanket, I know that I do not need to do another row of 4 to do 4 by 6. I'm just gonna do 4 by 5 for this blanket. Now, if you want a really large blanket, you do however many rows you want to do. But for me, I'm just gonna do 4 by 5, which means I have 20 squares of 10 rows total. So now we have a couple of things that we can do from here. If you want, you can just weave in all these ends and call it a day and be done. But I personally think a border really, really completes any project that you're working. So I definitely want to do a border. And I'm going to start by doing a border of this granny stitch all the way along this blanket and get one solid row of probably a white border. I haven't really thought that far yet, but I think I'm going to do a white all the way around the edges. And then of course, if we flip it over this way, we've got some of these ends that we need to weave in, but personally I like to do all of that at the end. All right, so taking my white yarn, all we're gonna do here is basically treat this massive quilt of 20 granny squares as if they were one. So get your yarn. Let me see, I wanna pull from the center, so I'm not pulling this yarn all around. Let me pull some out. And I'm going to start in a corner. I'll start in this one right here. I'm going to insert my hook into that corner space, pull up a loop, and just like we did, oh, my yarn's getting in the way. And just like we did when we were making the granny squares earlier, I'm going to chain 2, work a set of 3 double crochets, chain 3, insert into that same corner and work our next set of 3. Just like that. And then now we will work down this side, working in every single space, just like we've done this whole time, except now we're literally covering our entire massive quilt in one solid row of white granny square stitches. So once you make it all the way around your blanket, we're just gonna work a slip stitch the same way we've been doing this whole time, pull that through and tie it off. Now you could stop here, but I think more is more, personally. So what I'm gonna do at this point is I want to get off of this whole granny square stitch look, because I just think that it can get kind of monotonous to look at that the whole time. And it's gonna be nice to have your eye get pulled to just something a little bit different. So I'm gonna go into single crochet rows in different colors. I think I'm gonna do this next row in this really pretty green color. It's like the softest, yummiest, palest green without being like bright. It's still muted. I absolutely love it. So what we're gonna do here is I'm not gonna start in the corners. Well, I reckon I could. Let's go ahead and just start in the corners and get it over with. So we're gonna attach this yarn just like we've done the whole time, tie it into a corner, and we're gonna pull up a loop. I'm going to chain 1, and I'm just going to start working single crochets. Now into these corner spaces, I'll work 3 single crochets. And then what we're going to do that we haven't done this whole time is we're going to actually work into our stitches. So at the top of each of those double crochets that we worked, we will insert our hook and we will work single crochets. And you're just going to do this all the way around the blanket. Okay, so once you make it all the way around your blanket in the single crochets, you want to once again do a slip stitch to that original one that you started with. And I am going to just pull that through and tie it off. You could stop here, but I think I want to do 3 rows in total of these single crochet stitches. Now this does get a little bit more time consuming because it's individual stitches in each of those little stitches that we made with our granny squares. But the only thing that gets different when you add a color after this first round, we worked 3 single crochets into the corner space. But now, in order for this to keep growing, we need to keep increasing in those corners. So how we're gonna do that is we're gonna pull up our next color. Chain 1. And I'm gonna start working my single crochets once again. But when I get to the center stitch, which is this one right here, in our corner space, I'm gonna work 3 single crochets into that one stitch. And that's how we're going to expand on this round. And then other than that little change, you're just gonna keep repeating this to your heart's desire. Like I said, my plan right now is to do 3 rows of these total, so this one and then one more. But seeing is believing. I might go all the way to 5. So I'll let you know when I'm through. And of course, the last thing you'll do once you get your border to your desired size is you'll have to flip your project over. And as you can see, we have all kinds of tails that we'll need to weave in. But I've shown you how to weave in your ends. You'll just do that all over the back side of your project until all of these ends are totally woven in, and you will be finished with your blanket. So I'll meet you up at the very end when we're done. And that is how I made this beautiful granny square blanket. I ended up only doing 3 rows of the single crochet, and I think that it's just enough. I could have gone on and on, but I think that this is perfect just as it is. But the good news is you can make it however you want to make it, and that is the fun of being able to crochet and be creative. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope that it inspired you to get your yarn and your hooks out and make something beautiful for you or a friend or family member. We love y'all so much. Be sure to leave a comment down below if you have any questions at all for me. I'll do my best to answer them, and we will see you guys on the next one. Bye, y'all.